today's show, I welcome back Murtaza Hussain, investigative journalist at Dropsite News. We talk about world events, including a deep dive into the ongoings in Syria. This is your host, Omer, and welcome to the Ozone Podcast. Assalamu alaikum, Murtaza. Welcome back to the show.
Welcome, Salam. Thanks for having me, Omer.
Well, I appreciate you coming back. You've had some new career news since you've been here last time. Now you've joined Dropsite. Can you tell me a little bit about that and where we can find you now?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. We changed jobs since we last spoke. We're now at a new site. Myself, Jeremy Scahill, Ryan Grimm, and Naska Renner, all from The Intercept, are now at a site called Dropsite News, which is, I could say it's a site which was created to carry on the mission of The Intercept once that became no longer possible at the actual Intercept. So it's this website, dropsitenews.com. We cover foreign policy, foreign conflicts, especially these days, heavily focused on Israel-Palestine, Syria, and other related subjects. So, yeah, it's a Substack page, but we do breaking news reporting, interviews, podcasts, and reported investigations. And for people who like that kind of subject matter at The Intercept, specifically foreign policy and conflict-related coverage, you're going to be seeing a lot of that very, very laser focused at Dropsite. And we launched last July, and so far we have about 300,000 or more than 300,000 subscribers, including about 9,500 paid subscribers. We're trying to get more and more support, and we welcome everyone to sign up and help us do more of the coverage that I think only we're capable of doing, really, on many subjects.
So in terms of the paid subscribers, is there additional benefit to that, or is that just kind of supporting your reporting?
We made a decision to keep our coverage free no matter what, because it's really in the public interest to have this coverage. We're not going to put a paywall around our reporting in the future. No plans to do that. But we do need support to keep going and to keep that model. And, we've been very gratified that a lot of people have chosen to support us even without a paywall, just because they believe in the reporting, they want to see more of it. So, yeah, no paywall, not going to be a paywall, but we ask, for your support in the public to help us keep doing what we're doing.
So in terms of podcasts, where can we hear you now? I pretty regularly used to listen to The Intercepted with you and Jeremy. Sometimes there were some guest hosts. What is the best place now to listen to you on podcasts? Is it still The Intercepted, or now is it a different podcast? And what's the name?
It's the Dropsite News podcast, and it's on the dropsitenews.com. And unfortunately, I won't get into the whole legal aspect of it, but because there was an ongoing discussion about this. But effectively, we never had a chance to tell our listeners on the Intercepted feed what's happening or where to find us or anything. But for anyone listening now who used to listen to the Intercepted podcast, which you don't have access to the feed anymore, you can find me and Jeremy and others on the Dropside News podcast. We're going to hope to build that podcast out in the next couple months.
Great. So a lot has happened in the 14 months since we last talked. The world looks like it's changed quite a bit. So I wanted to start with what's going on in Syria. A couple months ago, it seemed kind of out of nowhere, at least to those that weren't paying attention. There was a rebellion and the government of Assad fell quickly. Can you walk us through what happened then? Was this kind of an organic rebellion? Was it fostered? Some people have conspiracy theories that it was kind of pushed by Turkey or the West. What happened then, and what are your opinions on what's going on now?
This uprising, I just came back from Syria, actually. I would say this uprising in 2024, when it took place, was pretty much against the will of most of the world. And I would say maybe the exception would be Turkey and perhaps Qatar. But the entire world had moved on and, wanted to renormalize with Assad for a number of reasons. He was a convenient kind of known commodity. And For Israel, they have a very long relationship with Assad and his father. They weren't necessarily friends, but they had an agreement to keep the border quiet. The European Union and the US, they wanted to stop the flow of refugees out of Syria, which was a huge concern for them. They needed someone as an enforcer there who could keep Syrians contained, so to speak. And, Assad could play, and he did play a serviceable role in that regard. And the UAE and a lot of the Arab League countries had been really pushing to renormalize the Syrian government. They let him back into the Arab League. The UAE especially was leading the charge to sort of rehabilitate his image after, all the terrible events of the last decade during the war and the allegations of war crimes and so forth, which took place in Syria, especially in the prisons. So no one really wanted this to happen. And everyone's quite surprised that it happened. And it happened really for a number of fortuitous circumstances combined to somehow make this possible. Now, mostly the rebellion had been crushed, and it was not one unified rebellion, to be honest. It was like three or four different separate rebellions, even more than that, localized in the country against the government. But there was one remaining pocket of opposition in the north. It's
Mhm.
called the province called Idlib. It was held and controlled by, an array of Sunni Islamist militant groups, with the most prominent among them was a group called Hayat Tahrir Sham, many of whom of its leaders have previously been affiliated with prescribed terrorist groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And yet they had formally repudiated those ties, but yet, the relationships and history, personal history still remained. So, they controlled Idlib and they were boxed in Idlib and they were pretty regularly bombed by the Russians and the Syrians or attacked by Iranian connected groups in the area. But a couple of things happened last year, in the last 2 years. First, the two major backers of the Assad government, military backers, have been seriously weakened. Russia is very, very tied up in Ukraine. They've been fighting a war there for a number of years now. It's very exhausting. Iran, its proxy group militias throughout the region have been heavily damaged by Israel over the past year, especially Hezbollah. So they weren't really able to defend the Assad regime anymore. And this group of people in Idlib, they've been preparing the whole time. They've been preparing for a day that, I should actually caveat that they didn't have any expectation that the government's going to collapse. They were planning. They did launch an operation called Operation Defense Against Aggression to retaliate against repeated attacks by the Assad government against their province, and push to the area maybe around Aleppo and establish a buffer zone. But what they found was when they started the defensive, the government defenses just kept collapsing. No one really was there to resist. Man, they took over Aleppo. That was very shocking. People thought maybe there would be a new front line created around Aleppo and it would stay like that for years, but they just kept pushing and they pushed all the way to Damascus. And Damascus fell pretty non-violently for the most part and into the hands of the new government. So, no one was happy with this. People were very concerned, again, with the exception of Turkey, which sent officials to Damascus to visit right after in very high profile sort of photo ops. The US was, very cautious. The EU was very cautious. The Arab states are very cautious about this. But the thing is, the opposition, the Hayat Tahrir Sham opposition, has created facts on the ground by taking over Damascus. And they've also been very pragmatic so far. They've attempted to reach out to the international community, attempted to reach out to other communities in Syria, which are naturally suspicious of a Sunni Islamist group like them, and attempt to be, portray themselves as being more inclusive at least. So I don't think this was a conspiracy. I do think it was just a series of events which took place, and this group and the Syrian opposition more broadly took advantage of that series of events to sort of turn the table on Assad. And the thing is, it kind of showed that Assad was really not very didn't have much popular backing in the sense that people were not willing to fight to die for his government at this point, except for foreigners like Russians or Iranians or Lebanese or some Pakistanis or Afghans who've been brought to the country to fight. At the end of the day, Syrians were tired of the war. They didn't feel this is a government worth defending. And then, secondly, I should say the sanctions also played a role. They did seriously weaken the government's ability to rebuild whatever capacity it had before the war. So, they took over and they're in power now. And I think Syrians have an opportunity now to take back control of their government and build something better. It's not necessarily going to happen, but I think they have a real chance now. And that chance did not exist under the previous government.
So it's interesting what you're saying that you don't think it's a conspiracy. And the reason I ask that is a lot of the leftists or so-called Assadists online, they like to say that Israel took advantage of this, and maybe they just did take advantage of the opportunity where they destroyed much of the Syrian Air Force and have now occupied parts of Western Syria near Golan Heights. There's been pictures of some mountains that they've taken over. Do you think that's just fortuitous for them that they were able to take advantage of this situation as opposed to them having any kind of working in concert with the rebellion?
No, because if you notice, they heavily bombed Syria, in addition to taking over this territory in the buffer zone, they heavily bombed Syria after the government came into power, and they destroyed the military equipment, which at that point would be the ownership of the new government, and they also killed a number of Syrians in these attacks. And secondly, the Israeli government's been loudly denouncing the new government. They've been demanding the international community not embrace it. They're very, very suspicious of it. And in fact, there was an Israeli government study or an open public commission which was created after the government in Syria fell, which said that this may create a far greater threat to us in the future because, they previously were at war with these Shia militant groups aligned with Iran. But those groups were, they operate in states which are very poor and dysfunctional, and Iran is a relatively dysfunctional country in its internal management. So it actually was an ideal opponent. And Assad was a perfect opponent for Israel because he's very weak and he's very boxed in and he suffered from a legitimacy crisis internally and externally. So he could stay in power. He wouldn't attack the border. They had a long agreement with him and his father, as I mentioned earlier, not to do so. And he also wouldn't develop Syria. Syria would stay poor and it would stay in its destroyed state, weak and not threatening to Israel. Then this is what the Israelis said in their study that an Ottoman Turkey backed Syria, the description of that they proposed, Sunni Islamist regime would be magnitudes greater threat to Israel potentially in the future. So they're already alarmed by the new government. And I think they may take steps to, really impede its ability to coalesce. And they are taking steps. They're trying to see if they can break off Druze communities on the border onto their side or help with the Kurdish-led separatist movements or autonomy-seeking movements in the north help buttress their position against the government. They are not happy about this government. They had a really good thing with the Syrian government for many, many years, and now they're in uncharted territory, so to speak. And another part, Israel under the previous Trump administration annexed the Golan Heights. The current leader of the Syrian government, Ahmed al-Shara, is nom de guerre was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani or Golani. He's from the Golan Heights. So these are not people who are going to, acquiesce in the same way. They're very weak right now. They can't really do anything to Israel. And I'll say that going to Syria really underlined to me just what a desperate state the country is and how little capacity they would have to fight Israel, which at the moment is extremely powerful. Those conspiracies, these Assadists, as you call them, I think they're very poor level of historical information because Assad was by no means threatening at all to Israel. He was a great asset to Israel, that relationship that they had. And, these pro-Iran backed groups, they had this narrative that, well, maybe some of the more honest ones would say, well, maybe he's not a great guy, but, we need Syria to be a node in this axis of resistance, which is necessary to fight Israel and defend against Israel effectively and so forth. But we've seen that these groups have no capacity to fight Israel. The Hezbollah, which was the most powerful and prominent among them, performed very poorly. There was no match for the Israeli military. So this whole argument why Syria needs to be this very oppressive police state, which is, an immoral case on its own, in my opinion, it's 25 million people who are Syrian, who are suffering as a result of the situation, didn't even make sense on its own terms. They did not deliver that. So, it's disappointing because I think that a lot of younger people in the last couple of years, maybe they've seen all these leftist quote unquote accounts on social media and in the public, who are very supportive of the Palestinian cause, seem to take this incongruent position in de facto in favor of the Syrian government. This very horrible, horrifying dictatorship, which has done terrible things, by no means less terrible than what Israel has done. Why are they taking this position? I think it's a lot of this is really ideological and not well grounded, and sometimes also the role of state connected information networks, especially around Iran or Russia, putting forward certain narratives. But I think that you're going to see something more positive, even if this government is 5 times as bad as it is right now. Still going to be a huge improvement. And I think that will ultimately help the Palestinians because a huge reason, in my opinion, the primary reason the Palestinians are so isolated and so weak is because the surrounding countries where the populations are highly sympathetic to Palestine, including Syria, they run in a dysfunctional manner and they run by regimes which are morally bankrupt and economically bankrupt, and they don't have any capacity to develop themselves, industrial based, technologically or anything, so they can't help Palestinians. But if Syria over a generation can be reconstructed in a manner that is dysfunctional, it's at least even as functional as Turkey, that would be a game changer. That would be a significant increase in leverage that Palestinians have to prevent what is happening right now under the current regime, which is the wholesale expulsion of the Palestinians from their historic homeland, which neither Egypt nor Syria nor Jordan or any of these regimes have the will or capacity to stop.
No, absolutely. I agree with that assessment, particularly of the incongruence of like the support for Assad while supporting Palestine. That didn't really sit well with a lot of people, observers, but it kind of makes sense the way you portray that narrative. Now, how was your trip to Syria? How easy is it for American to get there? This American audience, is it safe? What did you find there? And, what was your purpose of your trip?
Yeah, I wrote a personal narrative which I could share with you the link thereafter. Some brief observations from that trip on Substack. My Substack is connected to the Dropset News Substack, so you could also find it on there. I would say it was a very eye-opening trip. I had not been to Syria in many, many years, well before the war. I will say that I've never seen a country. I was in Ukraine last year, and there's a lot of destruction in Ukraine, and obviously the war has had a terrible impact on much of the population. But there was no comparison between Ukraine and Syria. Syria is destroyed on a level I've never seen in any context in any country, really. Every inch of the country has been impacted by the war, either directly by, shelling and destruction and airstrikes and barrel bombs and things like this, or just the degradation of society by poverty and the social impact of the war and the sanctions and so forth. So it's extremely destroyed. It's like an apocalyptic, I would say post-apocalyptic society at the moment. When I arrived at the border, well, I was expecting from what I'd read in the news that I was going to be encountered by, because it was reported that the Syrian government, the new regime, had not completely dismantled the old government. They didn't want to replace the de-Baathification policy of the U.S. in Iraq, where the U.S. just liquidated the entire Saddam Hussein regime and then created this chaos. They didn't want to replicate that, so they kept people in place. But when I went to the border, I crossed the border from Jordan into Syria. I was expecting to see the old government, maybe with some new bosses in charge. But instead, I saw only the new people. It was only the Hayat Tahrir Sham government, anyone from the top to the bottom at these official government posts. And all the faces and images of Assad and his father have been removed. And they used to be everywhere in the whole country. Can't find any of them anymore. And it was very informal. People were not wearing uniforms. They were just like young guys with AK-47s, look pretty confused. Some of them are bewildered. They're very young, a lot of the guards and so forth at the border. The people in charge, they weren't wearing uniforms, as I mentioned. They just didn't really seem to have any set protocols. So, what are the rules for Americans to get in? I don't think they even know right now. It's not really uniform per se. So, I got there and they said, what are you doing? Actually, no, they didn't even say, what are you doing here? They just said, are you happy to be here? I was like, yeah, I'm happy. And they said, okay, well, and then they got confused because they didn't know where to stamp the American passport because I guess they hadn't gotten a lot of Americans, but they just kind of looked around a bit and then called someone over and stamped it. And then they said, okay, get in. And they waved me in. So, that's the process. So I think someone else could go tomorrow and maybe have a completely different experience, but that was my experience because it's clearly not very standardized at the moment. It's a revolutionary situation in the country, and you really feel that. And I felt that last time, not since 2011 when I went to Egypt. I haven't seen that level of sort of buoyant chaos, I would put it, or kind of like a uplifting chaos, depending where you are in the country. That was the environment. The new flags everywhere, the revolutionary flag. You get in the country, everything is destroyed. You see it right from the beginning on both sides of the road to Damascus. Huge destruction of buildings. Roads have not been replaced or repaired in like 10 years. They're very hazardous. You get to the city, and again, it's shocking. Like basically, everyone's selling things on the street, like basic things like water bottles of gasoline for your car, or socks, used shoes, and stuff like that. It's like an unbelievable poverty, and nothing has been repaired in like 13 years. The whole country has been put into like a time capsule. It's just tremendous. Like for those people who are from Pakistan or have been to Pakistan or South Asia generally, Damascus feels like Karachi now. It feels like a level of poverty like Karachi, but also with like a mixture of like Gaza, because many districts of the city are completely destroyed. They look exactly like the photos of Gaza that you see on social media. You can drive for like half an hour through an area like Yarmouk, which used to be a Palestinian district of the city, or Daraya or Jobar, these areas where people rose up. It just goes on endlessly. Bombed out buildings, rubble. It looks like a horror film. That's the city. And in the normal areas, people are level of poverty and desolation is also like mind blowing. Even that's bad enough. But a lot of the city is completely destroyed on a physical level, and there's still people living in the ruins of these buildings with no electricity, no water, none of the basics of human life. Even a cat would struggle to live there, and yet whole families have been living there and for a very long time. They're very resilient people. It's tough. It's very difficult, and I will say that despite their conditions, people have a lot of dignity, and they send their kids to school, even if they live in literal destroyed ruins. Everyone's clothes are clean. The people are welcoming. They're nice. It's not dangerous in the daytime or even at night. I would say in most of these areas. It's a very strong culture that people have, which was not destroyed by the war. But yeah, it's very sobering to see all that. And, it doesn't paint the people responsible for this in a very flattering light morally. Obviously, all of us are, every single person with a conscience is horrified what's happening in Gaza at the moment, which is a genocide, I would say. But, a lot of this happened also the last 10 years in Syria. Those of us who pay attention to that, we're not really shocked by what happened in Gaza because they did a lot of the same things in Syria. And you see that very, very clearly in Damascus and Homs and Aleppo, which, there are Gaza's all over Syria, unfortunately, and you still see that today.
Well, it's interesting you alluded to Gaza while describing Syria because I do think there are a lot of parallels in the terms of destruction and the impact in human life. Actually, just a couple nights ago, I had dinner with a couple doctors that just gotten back from a medical mission in Gaza. I've had a few colleagues that have gone there. We got a chance to interview one on the podcast, and what they described is what you're talking about in Syria is complete destruction. Trump said that there's like 1.6, 1.7 million Gazans. Just that statement, I think before the war, the official number was, or unofficial number was like 2.2, 2.3 million. And we know there hasn't been an accurate death count. But what he's saying infers like maybe anywhere to 3 to 600,000 people have died. I haven't seen, I think it'd be difficult to get any kind of legitimate reporting on how many people have died. But did you find that his numbers kind of implying that? What are your thoughts about the death toll itself?
We did an interview with some doctors back from Gaza recently, maybe the same people we spoke with potentially on Drop Site a few days ago. And, from that conversation, and, I asked many of the same questions because, not a lot of doctors have gone in and, or anyone has gone in. Reporters can't go to Gaza. So to actually assess what's happened there, I think it's very likely that hundreds of thousands of people have died in Gaza. That's my, because, I will say something like, we've done some reporting about this. The health ministry in Gaza is very conservative in the way it records deaths. And, they record somewhere between 40 to 60,000 deaths. But they only record deaths of people that bodies they find and they can positively identify a name and have ID and things like that. and died specifically from trauma, like in the sense that they died from, a bullet or a bomb or something like that. Most wars, as a rough sort of hermeneutic, you could say that in most wars, the number of deaths caused by the war is usually 4 to 6 times the number of people who are actually shot or blown up. So they're called, indirect deaths. And, if you look at the total casualty figures from any war, they always include the indirect deaths. Even in the Holocaust, Anne Frank died from a disease. She didn't die from directly being shot or something like that. So that's never separated from the death toll. So if there's 40 to 60,000 people who died from direct trauma, conservatively, and not, you're not counting people still buried under the rubble or haven't been found, whose bodies haven't been identified, you could be looking at 250,000, 300,000 people actually dead. If the death toll, once they have a chance to actually do proper investigations when the fighting ceases for extended period of time, if the recorded death toll hits like 80,000 in the actual Ministry of Health figures from trauma, that could, mean 400,000 deaths. That could mean, 500,000 deaths. And I think that that is very, very likely. If you look at the conditions in like actual space, condensed space in which this war is taking place, the level of bombing which is taking place, nuclear bomb level of destruction isn't taking place in very compacted urban areas. I think that, yeah, you're going to see something historic, a very historic level of crime against civilians has been committed in Gaza. And I think that's also part of the reason that they keep dragging the war onwards, talking about getting people out of there or changing the subject with these ideas of, Trump buying it or whatever. It delays the reckoning, which is eventually going to come. And it's not to say that anything's going to happen, because sure, like they have the power, and who's going to actually get them in trouble for this? It's going to be like a Rwanda level of death eventually recorded when we actually know what happened in Gaza. And I think that when Trump says that, yeah, there is something to that. There's something very much to that. I think he probably knows or seen information that the U.S. has privately assessed hundreds of thousands dead. And, I encourage people in the U.S. government to, make that information known in whatever way they can, because it's very important for the historic record. It's just a great, great crime which has taken place. And I think that history, in as much as that matters, is going to remember that.
No, absolutely. Like the number you mentioned, 40,000, I think that when they were still able to count, that was almost in December of 2023 or January of 2024. And after that, counting became a little bit difficult. And I agree. Hopefully, someone leaks some documents about what the internal assessment is to someone like yourself or in DropSite to see what's really going on. Now, you're talking about Trump making these kind of outrageous claims about like displacing the Gazans and they can't come back and they want to develop the land and they're going to all this stuff. And there's some strongly worded statements from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, like, this is ridiculous. How much do you think of that is for public consumption, for their own political reasons, or how much of that is because they know that this is a problem, or is it from a moral perspective? Like, what prompted those statements, and what do you think is going to be the outcome of that? Because, I mean, those countries do have pretty good relations with the USA, and I know Trump wants to have good relations with Saudi particularly. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting because obviously Trump wants to make more of these Abraham Accord-like deals with between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Before October 7th, they were amenable to that. They were ready to take that step. But I think this has really changed things. October 7th has changed public opinion in these countries, especially Saudi Arabia, I would say. People are not happy with what's going on in Gaza. It's not a country where we can speak very openly, but you get the temperature of people. They're very unhappy, especially the young people who tend to make up the base of support for MBS. They're very, very, very paying close attention to what's going on in Gaza at the moment. I think that the impetus for the Abraham Accords was fear of Iran. That was a really big driver of it. They wanted U.S. and Israeli security guarantees to protect, Bahrain and Dubai and UAE and Saudi Arabia from Iran. But Iran's a lot weaker now. Ironically, because of Israeli actions, Iran has been cut down to size in a significant way. But also, these countries have also repaired their ties with Iran to a significant degree. They've actually normalized what was a very hostile relationship with Tehran to a more manageable state. So they don't really necessarily need Israeli protection anymore from Iran. And I think what's happening is Israel is now redefining itself as a primary threat to everyone in the region. It's not the case, or not how the way people viewed things a few years ago. The primary threat to the Gulf. Well, let me caveat that a little bit. Recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel suggested that, a Palestinian state should be created in Saudi Arabia. And it was a very offensive comment from the Saudi perspective, and also seemed to imply his a generalized lack of respect for sovereignty of all the countries in the region, including those he's trying to build ties with. And these attacks in Syria, these sort of threats against other countries, the fraying relationship with Egypt and Jordan, it's all adding up to suggest, the Israel problem is going to be back in the forefront in the coming generation, now that Iran has sort of been put into abeyance. So I don't see why they need to make this deal. And maybe Trump could, bribe them or bully them to a certain extent, but it's just not a very compelling necessity. And for everything you want to say about MBS, and he's a very troubling and problematic figure in many ways, he's still beholden to the views of his population to a degree. He can't completely be insensible to them. And I think that there's a sense of pride also among the Saudi royal family and the government, that they're not a city state like Bahrain or Dubai, which they can make a deal like this and does not have any avowed leadership role or perceived leadership role in the Arab world, the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia is a very serious country. It has a population of 25 million people. They take their national identity seriously, and they're doing some more at the moment. So I don't think that they're going to sell the Palestinians cheaply in this new context. There's not really an incentive for them to do that, unless Trump, threatens to invade Saudi Arabia or something like that, or they're in mortal danger from the Iranians or anyone else. I don't see that happening. And I could be wrong. I can't say exactly, but I do have, I have internal information and conversations and so forth. And my assessment at the moment is that they're not going to make any deal absent, irreversible, significant steps towards creating a Palestinian state in the future along the 1967 lines, which, I think Israel no longer wants to do. If it ever wanted to do that, it's not going to do it now. Yeah. So yeah, I don't see that happening. Um, but it remains to be seen what happens in the administration. A lot of surprising things are going to happen.
Do you expect the ceasefire to hold in Gaza?
I don't know exactly. I hope it holds, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that it will. Foremost among them is the fact that the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu, when the war ends, he's going to face very serious scrutiny from the Israeli public over the events of October 7th and his conduct, what led up to that, which allowed that catastrophic security failure to take place. And secondly, he also had ongoing criminal charges. There's a huge protest movement in Israel over this, in the lead up to these events. Those will be back in play once this war emergency is over. So I think that he's actually going to continue the war for a very long time, and probably he wants to restart the war in Gaza. Secondly, these scenes that we, saw in the last few weeks of the prisoner exchanges, they involved Hamas projecting an image of strength and survival. That is not the image that Netanyahu wants to end the war on. It's that it suggests to him that the public that he lost and all this was in vain, which obviously is what Hamas is trying to portray. That's not how they want it to end. I think that the Israeli public, in as much as they're afraid or vengeful or whatever emotions you may attribute, they probably would acquiesce to a continuation of the war in some capacity, and I think that Netanyahu is in favor of that as well too. So it's hard for me to imagine the war is going to end, and I don't think that the Trump administration is going to put great pressure on the Israelis to end it. They keep signaling that they expect that it might continue. So this all leads me to conclude that it's probably unlikely that the war is going to end anytime soon. Yeah, I wish I was more optimistic, and I do think it's possible ceasefire could hold, but yeah, all signs seem to point to that not happening and a continuation either in the short term or a little bit thereafter.
Well, that's unfortunate, but I think you have a good point is that one of Israel's stated goal was to eliminate Hamas, and that certainly didn't happen. So you alluded to Iran a couple of times, and Iran was quite in the forefront during much of the genocide and the war that was happening in Palestine. Some bombings with Iran and Israel back and forth, and a lot of blustering. We haven't heard too much from Iran recently. Do you think that's a function of like Hezbollah being kind of disabled, or is it just kind of taken a back role intentionally? Every now and then you hear some commentary about starting a war with Iran from the Trump administration, but that's been kind of talk that's been ongoing for years. So what's going on with Iran these days?
Well, it's interesting. It's a very complicated subject because on one hand, Iran has paid a very big price for its stance towards Israel, hostile stance and arming Israel's enemies and things like that in Gaza and in Lebanon and Yemen and elsewhere. On the other hand, I don't think that this Iranian stance towards Israel has necessarily been beneficial to Palestinian political cause. And the reason I'll say that is because, as you mentioned, we used to hear about Iran all the time. And I think for like a period of a decade, we only heard about Iran. We barely heard about Palestinians, and the Palestinians were not really on the agenda of the Washington or the Israeli establishment. They preferred having this issue with Iran because they could depict themselves as the victims or under threat by a much bigger power and change the subject from the fact that they are oppressing, material way a less powerful population than them in the context of the Palestinians. So, I'll kind of give you some context. In the 80s, there was a very formative event for Iran and particularly the current ruling crop of people in Iran, which was the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War was basically triggered by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran after the Iranian Revolution, and it was backed by all of the Arab states, or most of the Arab states, materially with arms and money. And, the war went on for like 8 years. A million people died. It was chemical weapons were used against Iranians. The cities were subjected to rocket attacks, and Scud missiles, and so forth. It was an extremely traumatic event. And most of the people in the Iranian IRGC and ruling establishment are actually veterans of that war. So their overriding concern is that never happen again. And they have a strategy called a forward defense strategy, and which means that, we'll make sure we fight. If we have to fight whoever our enemies are, we're going to make sure we fight them in Syria or we're going to fight them in Iraq. We're not going to fight them in Iran again, like as we did in the 80s. So, having all these militias, having this control of these countries, it kind of prevented that from happening. And obviously, in the end, it was the Israelis who broke the forward defense strategy because the government in Iran is ideologically hostile to Israel, revolutionary ideology. So, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But, this network of militias, I would say Iran is not very popular in the Arab world, even though, it is a country that was seemingly on the front lines of fighting Israel and still kind of is. That hasn't really brought a lot of popularity because it's a component of the strategy which is in practice destabilizing or in their people's views harming the sovereignty of these other Arab countries and taking the Palestinian issue off the priority list in a way, unintentionally or not. So I think that with the end of that, with the end of Iranian influence in these countries or the severe degrading of it at least, you're going to see the Palestinian issue become more prominent because that's becomes now the major issue on the table for the region. I think that the Trump administration doesn't want to have war with Iran. Actually, they've said that numerous times. And if you look at the staffing of the Pentagon, a lot of people are in there who are very critical of the idea of a war with Iran and are against it. It just remains to be seen how this issue with the nuclear program is resolved because Iran is closer than ever to a nuclear bomb. They chose to develop one, which they haven't as of yet. And, if they can make a deal with the Trump administration, submit their program to international safeguards in exchange for some sort of concessions like sanctions relief or lifting of sanctions on the Iranian central bank, the ability to sell oil, maybe that would be a way of ending this situation. But I think that the days of Iran being a major priority of foreign policy in the region, as they were in the last 15 years or so, probably are behind us, barring a real confrontation with Trump over the nuclear program.
You've done a lot of reporting on Pakistan. I think last time we talked in detail about some of the reporting you did about Imran Khan. Some Republicans clamoring for the release of Imran Khan. I know there's an envoy of Trump, Grinnell, who's mentioned this many times, and now recently, Republican Congressman Joe Wilson called for the release of Imran Khan. Now, I know there's a lot of Pakistani Americans. They have a political action committee that have been kind of pushing for this. What are your thoughts on what's going on in Pakistan in terms of Imran Khan and otherwise?
It's interesting because, again, a lot of people in the Trump administration, people I know even, who are quite sympathetic to Imran Khan, you could say, or they're sympathetic to him in the sense that they view him as a victim of the quote unquote American deep state, which they themselves also feel to be victims of. So, there is some latitude. We could see maybe some statements from Trump about this. At the same time, I'm not sure if they're going to get heavily involved in Pakistan and to the same degree and try to intervene and manipulate the politics of Pakistan in a direction which is more favorable to Imran Khan, for the very simple reason that the geopolitical relevance of Pakistan and the economic relevance of Pakistan have markedly decreased, I would say, in the last 20 years. It's on a huge downward spiral, over that time. And, nothing is really going on to force Washington to pay attention. That said, and we had a story about this at Dropside News last week, based on informed sources close to the Pakistani government and others. The Pakistani military is contemplating launching a major invasion of Afghanistan on the grounds of fighting ISIS groups in Afghanistan, with the hope that that would make them relevant to Washington again, and also thereby result in a resumption of counterterrorism and military funding from Washington to Islamabad. So if that happens, maybe you'll see more focus generally on Pakistan and DC. I don't know if they're going to fall for that trick because I'm not sure if the Trump administration wants to get involved in Afghanistan again. But they're trying that. But even then, I wouldn't see that necessarily as helping Imran Khan. It would probably be in the benefit of the military. So, all told, I think we may see some rhetoric from the Trump administration about this, and maybe some people in the administration who are sympathetic may push for something to help Imran Khan. And yet, I don't. I'm not particularly optimistic about that. I think that we may see the status quo continue as it is unless Pakistanis themselves change it.
That makes sense. I guess the people in power in Pakistan certainly don't want him out. So if it's not like high on the agenda of the Trump administration, it's less likely. Now, you talked about Trump earlier, talking about buying or taking over Gaza. And he's done that with his own allies. He's been talking about annexing Greenland, Panama Canal, Canada. To most people, this sounds like a lot of bluster and just tough talk. What are your thoughts? Because from some reading I've done, some of those countries are a little bit worried. I don't know if they're actually worried about military invasion, but there is some fear that Trump might try to do something that would be, unexpected. What's going on in terms of this?
Yes, I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the US, and people in Canada I speak to very often. They're very concerned about this actually, and the Canadian government takes it dead seriously that the Trump in the future or someone like Trump may try to annex Canada because of Canada's natural resources, or because simply just you know for the territorial aggrandizement of the United States, they may choose to do that. It would be really something which would happen against the will of Canadians. I don't think they would necessarily resist militarily because they have no capacity to do that. But they would try everything they could, economic or political resistance, to forestall that. There's really not any major constituency in Canada, and I suspect in other countries that this has been mentioned, for annexation by the United States. But I think it's a real prospect. And what we're seeing now is something very interesting, is that previously in the American Empire, there was and it is an empire, the US would allow states which were dependent on it to feel that they were actually partners and they were allies. So Canada, the UK, Netherlands, all these countries would be described as American allies and friends of America. Now we're seeing a new shift in the portrayal where these countries, which everyone knows are weaker or more dependent, not being described as friends and allies, they're being described more as, clients or satraps. They're not being allowed the flattering illusion that they were partners in the situation. They're letting them know in a very vulgar way that we're in charge here and you work for us. So, that's a shift. It's a very big shift, in, at least rhetorically and symbolically, in the way America conducts itself and with its Western fellow nations. So, there's bullying now happening with Canada and bullying happening in the Netherlands and bullying happening with the EU and NATO and so forth. So you're seeing America kind of turn inward a little bit and kind of dispense with some of these pretenses. Now, in a way, being honest is good because people can maybe adjust their own behavior in a way which is more realistic and maybe defend themselves effectively as a result of that. But, it's going to be a very painful and jarring learning curve for elites in these countries, including Canada and Europe and so forth, and how to deal with America, which is willing to strip them for spare parts now. I think that's basically what this is. We're taking countries which were, on paper allies, and we're saying, well, what can we get out of you? What can we break you apart and do for ourselves? And your own interests are, kind of, laughable. They're irrelevant to this calculation. So that's fascinating. And I think that, these countries could band together and try to make some new sort of conglomeration. Canada geographically could ally itself with the Scandinavian countries, East Asia. They could all band together. That's not going to happen, though. I doubt it. They don't have the vision to defend themselves. So if America really wants to take these countries and really draw the red line about it, yeah, they'll do that. And I think annexing Gaza is a little more fantastical. I don't see that really happening. But, they're saying it. And well, who knows? But this is a new style of American leadership we're seeing come to existence.
Yeah, I feel like we're in this new era where, some of the stronger countries are kind of exerting their will and just taking over territory, or at least talking about it in ways that we hadn't seen recently. Even in cases recently where there have been some wars, I've never seen like this open blustering from some superpowers. So finally, I wanted to ask you about Ukraine. I didn't realize you had gone there last year. Do you see that war wrapping up? I saw some documents about Trump-based plan about resolving the war in April. I'm not sure the validity of that or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's hard to say because Ukraine is in a very, very difficult position because when you go there, you really see quite viscerally the country's been hollowed out by the war. It's not the same level of destruction throughout the entire country as you see in Syria, primarily because the EU and the US has been helping prop up the Ukrainian economy during the conflict. So there's still a far greater degree of normality despite, widespread destruction and death, which is also visible. So, but they're kind of running out of people. They're literally running out of people because the front lines are so incredibly violent and there's so much death that's happening there that they're running out of young men to fight. And now there's this pressure to start drafting 18 to 25-year-olds who had previously been spared the draft because the country didn't want to. If you lose your entire young generation, you basically, in a very brutal way, you cease to exist the next generation as a people, and they wanted to stop that from happening. Now there's pressure for them to do that, to keep the war going, or to defend themselves and to get a adequate settlement from Russia. But it's really hard for me to see what settlement could actually end this war. And the reason is that, okay, maybe there's a ceasefire and Trump announces that, this peace returning to Ukraine, Russia will maintain the territories it's conquered so far of Ukraine. That'll become the new kind of front line, a DMZ type thing between Russia and Ukraine. Thing is, if you talk to Ukrainians, their view, this war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. And all Russia has done is, in the meantime, and the fighting has continued at a low level since then. All Russia's done in the meantime is take breathers and then resume the war. Because what they really want is not just the Donbass. They really consider Kyiv to be their territory. They consider Ukraine to be their territory. Russia's a much bigger, stronger country than Ukraine at the end of the day. Ukraine fought very, very well considering their size, but this is a much bigger country. If they start the war again in 5 years, Russia will have recovered a lot more than Ukraine. And also, the huge diaspora of Ukrainians, refugee diaspora, is not going to return to rebuild the country because they're afraid. They're afraid that why would I return to a country where if I believe the war is going to start again in 3 years, and I'll have to go through the same thing all over again, and maybe be drafted, or my son will be drafted, and go die, lose their limbs, and fighting Russia. No one wants that, and people don't really want to live under Russia. They're afraid of it, so the country just won't repopulate, won't rebuild, and there'll be a slow suicide effectively for Ukraine as a nation. So that's really a palpable sense in the country. People are pessimistic because where they're fighting off Russia for a very long time, Russia's making steady gains now. They've improved their own tactics. They're deploying foreign fighters, North Koreans, and even Yemenis and Indians and all types of people to go fight in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians don't have the ability to do on their own. So, it's a very bleak situation. I don't see Trump can only really make them surrender, and then he can dress the surrender up as though as like a peace deal, but it really will be a surrender unless Ukrainians get maybe NATO membership or they get security guarantees and the creation of DMZ like thing with the EU forces or American forces deployed on the front line as a buffer, things like that, which I haven't really seen proposed and probably not realistic. So yeah, I think the war could end, and that could be in the interest of people in Washington and so forth. But someone's going to lose, and it's going to be Ukrainians who lose the war. And however it's described, that's a reality. And I think that we should be sympathetic to Ukrainians because they really were the victims of the situation, and they had a pretty interesting project that they're working on as a nation before this happened. They were reemerging after many, many very, very long period of suppression and oppression that they suffered. And to have it end in this brutal and sudden fashion is quite tragic. But I think that's unfortunately the trajectory.
Well, that's interesting. I appreciate a lot of the insight you've given on Ukraine and all the other topics. Do you have any upcoming reporting or articles that you're working on that we can look forward to?
Yeah, I'll have some more reporting based on my trip to Syria, which should come out this week, and then some more reporting about the activities of pro-Israel lobby groups in the U.S. You can find all that on DropSite.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, and hopefully people can follow you and subscribe to your Substack and start listening to the Drop Site News podcast. I know I'll start listening to that more. Appreciate your time and being a friend of the show, and hopefully next time it won't be so long before we get you back on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Glad to chat with you anytime.
That's all for today's show. Please remember to subscribe and like wherever you listen to the show. Leaving a rating and review helps others find the podcast and helps the show. Until next time, I'm out.